Silas Renner had oiled the same spinning frame for 30 years the morning they gave his stool to a boy of 19 and told him to sweep the lint under it. He did not argue. He looked at the boy. He looked at the frame. Then he took the brass can from his apron and oiled the frame anyway, the way he had every dawn since before that boy was born. The young chief engineer watched him do it, and he laughed. 40 hands stood close enough to hear. "We keep the old man on out of charity," Preston Vance said. "He's a broom that remembers being a machinist." The superintendent nodded along like it was gospel. Under Silas's cot there was a soldier's trunk of dented tin. Inside it, a folded paper gone amber at the creases. And in his palm, always, a brass oil can worn smooth as a river stone, stamped once with 2 initials so faint no one had ever bothered to read them. If you believe respect is earned in silence, this story is for you. Before we go on, subscribe and comment the town you're watching from. I want to see how far Silas travels tonight. Now, let me take you to Haw Bend. Haw Bend, North Carolina. Autumn, 1938. The kind of town where the mill whistle set the clocks and the clocks set the men. You could smell the river from the loading dock and the cotton from everywhere. Ashmore Cotton Mills sat where the haw made its slow turn, 3 stories of red brick with the windows glowing yellow before the sun was up. Inside, the machines never truly slept. They only waited. Silas Renner got there first. He always did. 63 years old, and he still walked the 2 miles down from the ridge in the dark, lard pail in one hand, the other tucked deep in his coat where the brass oiler rode warm against his ribs. He liked the mill best this way. Empty, quiet enough to hear the frames tick as the heat came up in them. A man could think. He came in through the side door and hung his coat on the 3rd nail from the wall. It had been his nail for 3 decades. Nobody had ever said so. Nobody had needed to. He rolled his sleeves to the elbow and stood a moment in front of the No. 9. The No. 9 spinning frame. 120 spindles in a long steel row, ready to draw cotton roving into thread finer than a girl's hair. Most of the men on the floor could not have told you the No. 9 from the No. To 7, to Silas it was the difference between one child and another. He knew its sounds. He knew the low hum it made when it ran true and the small catch it made when the humidity climbed. He knew the exact spot on the main casting where the iron ran a hair thin. And he knew why. He set his pail down. He took out the brass can. And he began at the near end, the way he always began, one bearing at a time, a single drop, a wipe of his thumb, moving down the row like a man saying prayers he had said so long the words had worn smooth as the metal. The whistle blew. The floor filled. The day came in loud. They had a rush order that fall, and everyone knew it, and everyone was afraid of it. 22,000 yards of gray uniform cloth for the Piedmont Railway. Coat and trousers for every brakeman and conductor from Greensboro to the coast. It was the biggest contract Ashmore Mills had signed since the crash, and the railwaymen had made one thing plain. 6 days. The cloth on their platform in 6 days, or the order went north to a mill that could count. Gerald Ashmore had signed it with a shaking hand and a wide smile. Gerald was the president. He had inherited the mill from his father Ambrose, along with the big house on the hill and the pew at the front of the church. He was not a cruel man. He was a frightened one, which in a mill can be the same thing. That contract was the whole year. If it ran late, the doors closed, and 300 families in Haw Bend would learn what winter felt like with the power off. So the floor ran hard. And the man who ran hardest, though few would have said it out loud, was the old man with the broom they had given him. Because they had given him a broom. That was Preston Vance's doing. Vance had come down from a college in the north with a diploma in a frame and ideas in a leather case, and Gerald Ashmore had hired him to modernize the works. Vance was 31. He wore a necktie on the floor and kept his hands clean, and he had a way of looking at a man twice his age like he was reading a label that had faded. Within a month of arriving, he had rearranged the whole spinning room. New belts, new counts posted on the wall in his own square hand, and a new idea about Silas Renner. The old fellows, Vance told the superintendent, learned a trade that doesn't exist anymore. They oil by feel, they true by ear. That's not skill, Crane, that's superstition with grease on it. He tapped the clipboard. Put him on cleanup. Give his stool to somebody who can be trained. Hollis Crane, the superintendent, was a heavy-set man who had spent his whole life agreeing with whoever signed the checks. He mistook gray hair for rust. He mistook a slow hand for a useless one. So Crane went to Silas at the end of a shift, and he could not quite meet the old man's eyes. And he told him, "Sweeping now, and housekeeping. Keep the lint off the floor and out from under the frames. Company's going a new direction." Silas took it the way he took most things. He was quiet a moment. Then he nodded once and said, "All right." That was all. He hung the broom where his tools used to hang. But here is the thing the college man never noticed, and the thing I want you to notice, because you are the only one in this whole story who gets to see it yet. When they moved Silas off the No. 9, he did not stop tending it. He could not. On the first morning of his broom, he swept his way down the long aisle, slow, and when he reached the No. 9, he set the broom against the wall and he took out the brass can, and he oiled it, every bearing, the way he had for 30 years. Then he crouched at the base of the main casting, and with the corner of his rag he wiped a small square of iron clean of lint. There was something under the lint, filed almost flat, worn by decades of hands and grease, but there, if you knew to look. 2 letters cut into the casting itself, an S and an R. He wiped them clean out of habit. Then he covered them again with his thumb, the way you'd tuck a blanket over a sleeping child, and he stood up, and he took his broom, and he went on down the aisle. Nobody saw. Nobody ever saw. Vance saw the broom, though, and the broom pleased him. He liked to use Silas, not cruelly, he'd have told you. Instructively, when a new hand came on, Vance would walk him past the old man and say something like, "See there? That's the past. We keep it around to sweep up after the future." And the new hand would laugh because the engineer laughed, and Silas would keep sweeping like a man who had gone deaf years ago. He mocked the tools worst of all. Silas kept a small roll of them wrapped in oilcloth. Tools he had ground and shaped himself over the years, a scraper with a handle carved to his own grip, a pick bent to an angle you could not buy in any catalog. Vance found the roll one afternoon and held up the scraper to the crew like a man holding up a bone. "Look at this," he said. "Hand ground. He made this himself. In 1938, gentlemen, this man is making his own tools out of scrap because he doesn't trust a machine shop. He turned it in the light. It's a museum. We're paying a museum to sweep." The men laughed. Silas held out his hand. Vance looked at him and looked at the crew and enjoyed the moment 1 second longer than he should have, and then he set the scraper in the old man's palm. Silas rolled it back into the oilcloth. He said nothing. He went back to his broom. I want to tell you what he was thinking, because I've known men like Silas, and I can guess. He was not thinking about the engineer. He was thinking about a spring in the governor housing of the No. 9 that had been running warm for 2 days, and how in about a week, if nobody touched it, it was going to fail. He was thinking he was not allowed to touch it. And he was thinking about his wife. Nettie had been gone 4 years that autumn. She had been a small, straight-backed woman with a way of saying a hard thing so gently you didn't feel the edge until later. Near the end, in the back room of the house on the ridge, she had taken his oil-stained hand in both of hers, and she had looked at him a long time, and she had said something he had carried every day since. "Silas," she said. "A name means nothing if you're too proud to sign it." He had not answered her. He had thought he'd known what she meant. He had been wrong about how much she meant. But that is later in the story. Hold on to it. For now the order ran, and the days burned off the 6 like matches, and the floor got tighter and louder and meaner as the deadline came on. And on the 3rd day, Preston Vance did the thing that a whole town would remember. It was the afternoon shift change, and the room was full. Better than 40 hands, spinners and doffers and the sweep boys, all of them there for the count posting. Vance stood up on the low platform by the office door with his clipboard, and he read off the numbers, and the numbers were good. And he was pleased with himself, and pleasure made him generous with his contempt. He caught sight of Silas near the No. 9 with the broom. "Renner," he called out, loud, so it carried. "Come here. Come on. I want to use you." Silas came. Slow, unhurried, the broom still in his hand, he stopped at the edge of the platform and looked up at the young man, and 40 faces turned to watch. "Boys," Vance said, "you want to know what happens to a man who won't learn?" He gestured down at Silas like a schoolmaster at a chart. "Here he is, 30 years on one machine. 30 years, and what did he build? Nothing. What does he own? A broom and a can of oil. He is what you become if you decide the world stops the day you stop learning." He smiled. "The blade comes down the same on everybody, gentlemen, on the smart and the stubborn both. But it comes down slower on the men who see it coming. This one never looked up. The guillotine line. That's what the men called it after. The blade comes down the same on everybody. It was a good line, and it was a cruel one, and Vance knew both. And he let it hang there in the lint-thick air while the crew shifted, and a few of them laughed the small, ashamed laugh of men who are glad it isn't them. Silas Renner stood and took it. He did not flush. He did not look away. He looked at Preston Vance the way you'd look at weather. And when it was over, and Vance had turned back to his clipboard already bored, the old man lifted his broom and set the bristles to the floor and swept the little pile of cotton lint into a neat gray drift, right there at the foot of the platform, in front of all of them. Then he moved on down the aisle, unhurried, and the machines swallowed the sound of him. Hollis Crane, up on the platform, wanted to smooth the moment over the way he smoothed over everything. He chuckled and leaned to Vance and said, "Loud enough to be a joke and not quiet enough to be private. Don't mind the old boy. Harmless, still keeps all his junk in a soldier's trunk under his cot like he's shipping out any day now." He laughed at his own picture of it. 30 years and everything the man owns fits in one tin box. A couple of hands laughed. Vance didn't even look up. The soldier's trunk. Thrown out into the room like a peel off an apple and forgotten by everyone in it before the next machine cycled. Remember it. You're the only one who will. That was the third day. On the fourth, the order began to slip. It was small at first. A count came up short on the morning board. Then another. Vance had pushed the frames faster than the room liked, and the room began, in its thousand small ways, to answer him. Threads broke and had to be pieced. A belt ran hot and had to be dressed. The doffers fell behind and the roving built up. Nothing you could point at. Just the slow, sullen resistance of old iron driven by a man who did not understand it. And 100 little failures adding up toward one big one. Gerald Ashmore came down onto the floor that afternoon, which he almost never did, and he stood beside Vance with his soft hands working at each other, and he asked the question presidents ask. "Are we going to make it?" "We'll make it," Vance said. He did not look entirely sure. And it was that same afternoon that Silas said the thing about the Governor Spring. He was sweeping near the No. 11 when Vance's crew opened the Governor housing on that frame to check a wobble in the count. 2 young machinists with the blueprints spread on a stool, arguing about it. Silas passed with his broom, slow, and without stopping, without even seeming to look. He said in his low, flat voice, "It's the outer spring on the flyweight. Right one. It's gone soft. She'll surge before she settles." The 2 young men looked up. Vance was 10 feet away and heard it. He came over, and he had a smile ready. "Is that a fact?" Vance said. "The sweeper's diagnosis." Silas didn't answer. He was already 3 steps down the aisle. They pulled the housing apart. And the outer spring on the right-hand flyweight was soft. Gone weak and out of true, exactly as he'd said, before a single one of them had touched it. There was a beat where nobody spoke. One of the young machinists looked at Vance almost afraid to. And Vance, who could not let it stand, laughed and shook his head and said, "Lucky guess. Man's had his hands in these things so long he's bound to be right one time in 10. Broken clock, gentlemen." He clapped the machinist on the shoulder. "Change the spring. Let's move. Lucky guess. Broken clock." They put it away in the little box where men put the things that frighten them, and they closed the lid and they went back to the order. But one of the young machinists, a quiet boy named Turner, did not entirely put it away. He watched the old man go down the aisle with his broom, and he thought about how a man diagnoses a spring he cannot see, on a machine he is not allowed to touch, and does it in 6 words without breaking stride. And he filed it somewhere, the way you file a thing you'll need later and don't yet know why. That was the 4th day. 2 left. And I want you to feel the shape of it now, the way the whole mill was leaning toward one moment without knowing it, the way a room full of people can be walking toward a cliff in the dark with a man among them who can see it fine and has been told to keep his mouth shut. Because Silas knew about the governor on the no. 9. He'd known for 2 days. The same soft spring trouble he'd named on the no. 11 was creeping into his own frame, the one they'd taken from him, and it was worse there, because the no 9 was different from the others in a way that was not in any book, and the governor on the no 9 carried a load no drawing showed. He knew it the way you know your own knee is going to give on the stairs. And he was not allowed to touch it. So every morning he oiled it, and wiped the 2 worn letters clean, and covered them with his thumb, and went to his broom, and waited for the thing he could not stop. The 5th day, it came. It was mid-morning, the light coming gray through the high windows, the whole room running full for the deadline, and the no 9 began to sing wrong. Silas heard it from the far end of the floor. He was the only one who did. It started as a hum a half-tone high, a whine coming up under the general roar, the sound of a governor hunting and not finding. The flyweights surging out and snapping back, surging and snapping, faster, the frame beginning to shudder down its whole 120 spindle length. He turned. He was already moving, broom forgotten against a post, moving faster than a man his age had any business moving, down the long aisle toward the sound. He was 10 feet away when it let go. There is a sound a big machine makes when it dies, and if you have heard it once you never forget it. The governor jammed. The flyweights locked. The stop motion that should have eased the frame down instead slammed it, and the whole drivetrain had nowhere to put the force. The main shaft sheared with a crack like a rifle in a barrel. Threads snapped in a long ripping hiss all down the row. And then, the no. 9, that had run true for 30 years, stood dead in the middle of the floor with 120 broken ends and a wisp of hot smoke rising from the governor housing. The whole room stopped to look. You could hear the other frames running and, under them, the terrible new silence where the no 9 used to be. Preston Vance came at a run. For the next day and a half, that governor housing was the center of the world. Vance had it open in 20 minutes, sleeves finely rolled, tie tucked into his shirt. The blueprints from the company file spread on 2 stools beside him and waited at the corners with wrenches. He had his best 2 machinists on it. He had Turner on it. They worked through the dinner whistle and past dark, and the lamps came on, and Gerald Ashmore stood at the edge of it wringing his soft hands, and the deadline clock ticked in every man's chest. And they could not fix it. I want to tell you why they couldn't. Because it is the heart of the thing, and you'll understand it before Vance does. They had the blueprints. The official company drawings for the no 9's governor filed away in Ashmore's cabinet since the frame was installed. And the blueprints were clear and clean and complete. The trouble was that the machine did not match the drawings. The drawings showed one mechanism. A stop-motion governor of an ordinary, honest kind. The sort you'd find in any spinning frame of that age. But when Vance's men got down into the actual iron of the no 9, they found something else. A second set of linkages the drawing didn't show. An extra cam, a compensating arm, a whole small clever system built into the governor that eased the flyweights instead of letting them snap, that let the No. 9 run faster and truer than a frame like it ever should have. It was beautiful work. It was work nobody could account for. It was as if, sometime long ago, someone had reached into the machine and made it better than its own plans, and never written down what he'd done. And now that hidden system had failed in a way the drawings could not explain. Because the drawings did not know it existed. Vance's men kept setting the governor the way the blueprint said. And the blueprint was describing a different, simpler machine, and so every time they buttoned it up and turned it over, it fought them and jammed again. They were trying to heal a body from a map of the wrong body. By the second morning, Vance's clean hands were black and shaking. He had not slept. Ashmore had gone from wringing his hands to a kind of gray stillness, standing by the office door. Because the railway man had telephoned twice, and the second call had been short. One more day. The cloth on the platform tomorrow, or the order went north, and the doors of Ashmore Cotton Mills closed for good. "It's not in the drawings," Turner said quietly, at one point, staring into the housing. "Whatever's in there, sir, it's not on the paper." "I can see that," Vance snapped, but it had rattled him, you could tell. Because an engineer's whole faith is that the machine is knowable, that the drawing is the truth and the iron obeys it, and here was iron that had a secret its own maker's plans didn't share. It was like finding a room in your house you'd never seen. That was the 5th night into the 6th day. The morning the order was due, the No. 9 sat open and dead, and every frame the mill had was already running flat out, and it would not be enough. And the whole thing, the contract and the mill in the winter for 300 families, hung on one machine that no engineer in Haw Bend could raise. And Hollis Crane, the superintendent, the man who had told Silas he was going a new direction, stood in the corner of that failure and did the bravest and most desperate thing of his life. He waited until Vance had his back turned. Then he went and found the old man. Silas was in the storeroom off the spinning floor, sitting on an upturned crate with his supper pail unopened beside him, listening. He had heard every hour of it through the wall. He knew exactly what was wrong. He had known before the shaft sheared. He sat there with the brass can in his 2 hands, turning it slow, and he waited, because some part of him had always known this morning would come, one way or another. Crane came in and stood in the doorway and could not, at first, get the words out. He was a proud man, too, in his small way. Finally he said, "Lo, Silas, the 9. We can't," he stopped. He tried again. "We've had it open 30 hours. Vance and his boys. Nobody can make it run." His voice cracked on the plainness of it. "The whole thing goes today. All of it. Everybody's job." He looked at the floor. "You know that machine. God help me, I don't know why I know it, but you know that machine. Will you look at it?" Silas was quiet for a long moment. He turned the brass can over once more in his hands. Then he stood up. He didn't say yes. He didn't say anything. He set the can in his apron pocket, and he reached under the crate for the roll of oilcloth with his hand-ground tools in it, and he walked past Crane out onto the floor. The men saw him coming, and a hush ran ahead of him. Vance was bent into the housing, arguing with the blueprint, and he did not notice until Turner touched his arm. Then he straightened and turned, and there was the old man, the sweeper, the museum, standing at the No. 9 with a roll of homemade tools under his arm and no expression on his face at all. Vance opened his mouth. Whatever he was about to say, Ashmore's voice cut across it from the office door, thin and frightened. "Let him look." Just that. The president had run out of pride. "For the love of God, Preston, let the man look." Silas Renner set his oilcloth roll on the stool. He did not open the blueprints. He did not even glance at them. He crouched at the governor housing, and he took the brass oil can from his apron, and for a moment, in front of all of them, he just laid his hand flat on the cool iron of the frame. the way you'd lay a hand on the flank of an animal to let it know you were there. Then he went to work, and it took him about 90 seconds. He unrolled the oilcloth and took out the bent pick and the hand-ground scraper, the very tools Vance had held up to be laughed at. He reached into the housing, past the linkage the drawings showed, down to the hidden compensating arm the drawings did not, the extra clever system no engineer in that room had been able to name. He found the soft outer spring on the flyweight, the same failure he had spoken aloud 2 days before and been called a broken clock for. He seated a small shim he took from his own apron, a shim he had ground for exactly this, years ago, and carried ever since. 3 moves. A quiet turn of the pick to free the jammed cam. A press of the scraper's flat to reset the compensating arm to the angle only he knew it wanted. And a single drop of oil from the brass can onto the one bearing that mattered. He drew his hands out. He wiped them on his apron. He stepped back. "Turn her over," he said. It was the first thing he had said on that floor in a day and a half. Turner looked at Vance. Vance, white-faced, said nothing, so Turner threw the belt. The No. 9 came alive. Not with the surge and snap it had died on. Smooth, the governor took up its load and held it, the flyweights easing out and settling the way they were built to, the way the hidden mechanism made them. And the long frame began to turn, all 120 spindles, the low true hum coming up under it. The sound Silas Renner knew better than his own heartbeat. It ran. It ran like it had run for 30 years. It ran like it would run for 30 more. The room made a sound. Not quite a cheer. Something rawer than that, a kind of exhale from 40 men who had been holding their breath toward the edge of a cliff and been pulled back. And Silas Renner did not stay to hear it. He rolled up his oilcloth. He put the brass can in his apron. He picked up the broom he'd left against the post an hour and a half before. And he turned to walk back down the aisle to his cotton lint, an old man with a broom, having just saved the mill and every job in it. Saying nothing. Asking for nothing, going back to the corner they'd put him in. He got about 4 steps. "Wait," Vance's voice, cracked and too loud. "Wait." The engineer came around the frame, his ruined hands half raised, his face a war between humiliation and something that was almost fear. He stared at the old man like he was seeing him for the first time and could not make the pieces fit. "How did you?" He stopped. Swallowed, started again, and his voice was not the voice he used from the platform. It was small. "That mechanism. It's not in the drawings. It's not in any drawings. I've been at that housing for 30 hours. How did you know what was in there?" The whole floor had gone still to hear it. Gerald Ashmore in the office doorway, Hollis Crane by the wall with his mouth open, the boy of 19 who'd been given the stool. Turner, watching the old man's face with something dawning behind his eyes. Silas Renner stood with the broom in his hand and looked at Preston Vance for a long, long moment. And whatever answer was behind that plain, quiet face, he did not give it. Not yet. He only shifted his grip on the broom, and he glanced, just for half a second, down at the base of the main casting, at the small square of iron he wiped clean every morning and covered with his thumb. Then he looked back at the engineer. "You wouldn't have believed the spring," he said. "Why would you believe the rest of it?" And he turned, and he walked back down the aisle to his lint, and left 30 hours of failure and one impossible answer standing behind him in the humming light. Behind him, unseen by every man in that room but one. 2 worn letters caught the gray morning where he'd wiped them clean. An S. And an R. Vance stood staring at the machine that was not in his drawings, and the question was already eating him, and it would not let him sleep, and before this was over it would drive him to a dusty cabinet in the front office and a patent file he had never once thought to open. But that is the next thing. That is what happens when a proud man cannot bear a mystery. He goes looking. And he finds a name. Whose name, and what it costs him, and what an old man kept folded and amber in a tin trunk under his cot for 14 years, that is where we go next. Stay with me. Because Silas Renner was about to be given a reason, at last, to sign it. Vance did not sleep that night. I told you he wouldn't. He sat in the little glass office off the floor with the failure still in his hands, and he could not put it down. A man had walked out of the dark with a broom and beaten 30 hours of engineering in 90 seconds. That is a thing a proud man cannot carry. It sits on his chest. It asks him questions in the dark. So he did what proud men do. He went looking for a way to make it his own again. The blueprints were spread across the drafting table. He had them by heart now. Every line, every gear tooth. And every line of them was a lie because the machine on the floor did not match the paper in his hands. The paper showed a simple governor, a spring, a weight, a fly arm. What was inside that casting was something else. Something with a second cam that no draftsman had drawn. A compensating arm that answered to nothing on the page. Someone had built a better machine than the one the company owned. And then hidden it inside the one the company owned. And never said a word. Vance turned that over and over. And near 2 a.m, with his eyes burning, he stood up and he walked out through the dead floor to the front office. And he opened the file cabinet nobody opened, the one with the old records, the paper from before he was born. He was looking for the patent. The original patent for the No. 9 governor. He wanted to see the name on it. He expected to find Ashmore. Ambrose Ashmore, the founder, the old man in the portrait over the stairs. He found a name, all right. The assignment paper was there, brittle and brown at the folds. Patent number 1144207. Automatic stop-motion governor. And down at the bottom, in a hand pressed hard into the page 14 years ago, was the name of the man who had signed the whole thing away. Silas Renner. Vance stood in the cold office and he read it 3 times. The sweeper. The broom. The old man he had called a machine that remembered being a machinist. Silas Renner had signed this patent over to Ashmore Cotton Mills in the summer of 1924. And Vance, God help him, could not make himself believe it yet. He told himself it was a coincidence of names. He told himself a laborer could not have drawn what was inside that casting. He told himself a great many things, standing there in the dark, because the truth was too big to walk through the door all at once. But the filed-down letters on the base of the No. 9 had a shape now. An S and an R, and they were not a coincidence. They were a signature, cut into iron by the man who made it. Word travels in a mill the way water travels downhill. By the next afternoon it had reached the sweeper's corner that the chief engineer had been in the old files, and that he'd been asking the front office about a patent, and that a name had come up, and the name was Renner. Silas heard it and he did not stop sweeping. He finished the aisle. He finished the row. He set the broom against the wall the way he set it every day, in the same place, the 3rd nail from the wall, and he walked the 2 miles home in the falling light with his hands in his pockets and his face giving away nothing at all. But that night he did a thing he had not done in 4 years. He pulled the soldier's trunk out from under his cot. It was dented tin, army issue, older than the mill. Crane had joked about it once in front of the whole floor. The old man still keeps his junk in a soldier's trunk. Threw it away like it meant nothing. And Silas had let him, because the joke kept them from looking, and Silas Renner had spent 14 years making sure nobody looked. He lit the lamp. He knelt down, slow, his knees not what they were. And he opened it. The smell came up first, old paper and gun oil and something like cedar. On top was his wife's shawl, folded square. He set it aside with both hands. Careful, the way you'd lift a sleeping child. Underneath was his life. The drawings were on the bottom, rolled in oilcloth. He drew them out and unrolled them on the floorboards, and the lamplight fell on lines he had made in 1922. A young man's lines, sure and fine. The governor. His governor. Every cam and arm and linkage that lived inside that casting on the floor 2 miles away, drawn here in his own hand 16 years before, complete, correct, and dated. There were letters too, folded paper gone amber at the creases. Letters from the United States Patent Office in Washington addressed to Mr. Silas Renner, Haw Bend, North Carolina, congratulating him, granting him. His name typed clean across the top of a government seal. And there was the last paper, the one that had cost him everything. The assignment, the one that carried his own signature, pressed hard, the day old Ambrose Ashmore had sat him down in the front office with a glass of good whiskey and a fatherly hand on his shoulder and called it a formality. A company improvement waiver, Ambrose had said. Just protects the work, son. You go right on tending your frame. Nobody's taking anything from you. And in the corner of that paper, witnessing it, was another name in another hand. Odell Pruitt, the draftsman. A young man then, standing in the room the day it was done. Silas sat on the floor a long time with the papers in his lap and the lamp burning low. His wife had been dead 4 years, and he could hear her as clear as if she were in the next room, the last argument they ever had. Her voice not angry but tired, so tired of watching him swallow it. A name means nothing, Silas, if you're too proud to sign it. She'd told him to fight it while there was still time. And he wouldn't. Because fighting it meant standing up in front of men who had money and lawyers and a father's good name and calling a dead man a thief. And Silas Renner had never in his life been able to make himself that loud. He'd rather tend the machine. He'd rather cut his initials in the iron where nobody could see and keep the secret that only his hands knew and let that be enough. It had never been enough. He knew that now. On the floor, in the lamplight, with her shawl beside his knee. He looked at the drawings for a long while. Then he folded the assignment paper along its amber creases, and he put it in his breast pocket, over his heart, and the next morning he did not walk to the mill. He walked to the county courthouse. Now I want you to understand what it cost him to walk up those steps. This was a man who had not raised his voice in 30 years. Who let a boy of 19 take his stool and said nothing. Who let them call him a broom. Walking into that courthouse and filing a claim against the family that owned the town, that was the loudest thing Silas Renner ever did. Louder than any machine. And he did it with his hat in his hand and his heart going like a hammer. He found a lawyer, a young one, the only one who would take it. A man named Fisk, who read the papers at his desk and then read them again and then looked up at the old sweeper across from him with a different face than he'd started with. "Mr. Renner," he said. "Quiet. Do you know what you're holding?" "I know," Silas said. The word reached Ashmore Cotton Mills the way a spark reaches cotton. Fast, and then everywhere. Gerald Ashmore, the son, the president, sat in the office his father built, and he read the summons with a hand that was not steady. He was not a wicked man, Gerald. He had inherited the mill, and he had inherited the crime along with it, and he had never once looked hard enough to see it. Because the papers were clean, his father had told him the papers were clean, and a man believes his father. He called his lawyers. 3 of them came up from Greensboro in a black car. They sat in the boardroom, and they told Gerald Ashmore what men like that always tell men like Gerald. That the trunk was company property, that the drawings were made on company time. That a waiver was a waiver and a signature was a signature, and no county judge would take the word of a mill sweeper over 14 years of corporate record. They told him to fire the old man. To turn him out. And if he made noise, to see that no mill from Haw Bend to Charlotte would ever put a broom in his hands again. Blacklist him, they said. He's 63. He'll fold. And Preston Vance sat in that boardroom and heard all of it and said not one word. But something had turned in him, in the dark, over those blueprints. Because Vance was arrogant, and Vance was cruel with his contempt, but Vance was an engineer. And an engineer's whole soul is the belief that the machine tells the truth. And the machine had told him the truth. The machine did not care about the papers. The machine had a second cam in it that only one man on earth had ever drawn. He had seen the drawings now. Fisk had shown them to the court, and the court record was open, and Vance had gone and read them with his own eyes. They matched. Line for line, they matched. His late-night hell, the 30 hours. The mechanism that wasn't on any page. It was on a page. A page dated 1922, in the hand of the man he'd called a broom. They tried to make him fold before it ever reached the courtroom. 2 days before the hearing, Gerald's lawyers came to the sweeper's little house on the edge of town, in the black car, and they knocked on his door and they laid it out kind and reasonable. Sign a release. Give back the trunk. Take $100 and your pension, and go quiet, old man, and don't make us do the other thing. Silas stood in his own doorway with his wife's shawl folded on the trunk behind him, and he listened to all of it. Polite. The way he listened to everything. And when they were done, he said the second sentence anybody had heard him say in weeks. My wife told me to sign my name, he said. I mean to do it in front of a judge. And he closed the door. The hearing was in the judge's chambers because the courtroom couldn't be trusted to hold what came. They came anyway. Word had gone through every mill house in Hawbend and out into the county, and on the morning of it, the hall outside the judge's chambers was packed shoulder to shoulder with mill hands in their clean shirts. The ones who'd watched him sweep, the ones who'd laughed, and the ones who hadn't, standing in the courthouse hall with their hats in their hands to see what happened to the old man of the know. 9. Inside it was close and warm. The judge was a lean old man named Hargrove, with reading glasses down his nose and no patience in him for anybody, rich or poor. He'd been on that bench 31 years. He had watched the Ashmores build the town, and he was not afraid of them, and that, more than anything, is why what happened could happen. Gerald's 3 lawyers took one side of the table. Fisk and Silas took the other. Vance was there. Crane was there, sweating through his collar. Gerald Ashmore himself sat behind his lawyers with his hands folded and his face gray. They read the assignment first, the company's paper. Signed Silas Renner, 1924. The lawyers made much of it. A clear conveyance, Your Honor. Signed freely. Witnessed, 14 years unchallenged. Then Fisk stood up. And he was young, but he was not afraid either, and he laid the other papers on the table one at a time. The original drawings, dated 1922, 2 years before the assignment. The examiner's letters from Washington. Addressed to Silas Renner. Granting patent number 1144207 to Silas Renner, sole inventor. Your Honor, Fisk said. My client did not sell a company's improvement. My client invented this machine. He held the patent in his own name for 2 years before Ambrose Ashmore ever put a paper in front of him. And I intend to show that the paper he signed was got by fraud. The chief lawyer from Greensboro laughed, a little, the way Vance used to laugh. By whose word? He said. The old man's own? A man will say anything when there's money on the table. Who witnessed this fraud? Where is a soul who was in that room in 1924? And the door at the back of the chambers opened. Odell Pruitt came in slow, on a cane, 80 years old if he was a day, in a black suit gone shiny at the elbows. He had been the draftsman. He was the name in the corner of the company's own paper. He had witnessed the signing with his own hand, and he had carried it for 14 years the way Silas carried the trunk. And Fisk had found him in a rooming house 2 counties over and asked him one question, and the old draftsman had said, I wondered my whole life if anybody would ever ask. They swore him in. He sat in the chair beside the judge's bench, and he folded his spotted hands on the head of his cane, and he told it. I drew for Ambrose Ashmore 11 years, Odell said. His voice was thin, but it did not shake. I knew the Renner governor before it went in the know. 9. Everybody in that shop knew Silas built it. It was his. There wasn't a question in any man's mind whose it was. Tell the court about the signing, Fisk said. The old man looked over at Silas, and something passed between them, 2 old men across a warm room, 14 years late. Mr. Ambrose called Silas up to the office, Odell said. 1924. Summer, had me come up to witness it. Poured him a whiskey. Told him it was a waiver. Told him it just kept the design safe inside the company so no competitor could steal it. Told him, and I heard him say it, I heard him say the words, "Nobody's taking anything from you, son. You go on tending your frame." Odell's jaw worked. And Silas trusted him. Silas signed. And it wasn't a waiver. I typed the thing myself the week before. It was a full assignment of the whole patent for $1, and Silas never read a line of it because Ambrose Ashmore was standing over him with his hand on his shoulder like a father. And a man doesn't read the fine print off the hand of a man he trusts like a father. The Greensboro lawyer stood up fast. This is a memory of 14 years. Uncorroborated, a grudge. I've got no grudge, Odell said, and he looked at him with 80 years of contempt. I've got a conscience. There's a difference. You'll learn it or you won't. The judge let that sit in the room. Then he took off his glasses. Sit down, counselor, Hargrove said. And here is the moment. Here is the one I brought you all this way for. The judge turned to the company's own engineer, to Preston Vance, 31 years old, Northern College, the man who had called Silas Renner a broom in front of 40 hands. You're the chief engineer of these mills, the judge said. You've had these machines apart. You've read both sets of drawings, the company's and Mr. Renner's. He put his glasses back on and looked at Vance over the top of them. Under oath, son, tell this court. The machine on that floor, the one that runs, does it match the company's blueprint or does it match the paper Silas Renner drew in 1922? The room went so quiet you could hear the courthouse clock in the hall. And I want you to see Vance. I want you to see what it costs a proud man to say a true thing that unmakes him. Because he could have lied. His whole career sat on that answer. His employer sat 6 feet behind him with a gray face. And every ounce of the contempt he'd carried his whole life told him to hedge, to muddy it, to say the drawings were close, to give the lawyers something to work with. He looked at the judge. He looked, for 1 second, at the old man across the table, the sweeper, the broom, the man who had freed the governor in 90 seconds while Vance stood there with 30 hours of failure on his hands. It matches Mr. Renner's, Vance said. His voice was low. But it did not waver. The company blueprint describes a simpler governor. The machine on the floor contains a compensating mechanism, a second cam, an extra linkage that is not in the company drawing at all. He swallowed. It is in Mr. Renner's drawing. Exactly, every dimension. There is no other hand it could be. That machine has run for 30 years on an improvement that only Silas Renner ever recorded. And it is the reason, and here his voice caught, just slightly, just enough, it is the reason none of my engineers could fix it. We were reading the wrong paper. He built the right one. Gerald Ashmore closed his eyes. The lawyers from Greensboro did not say anything, because there was nothing left to say. The company's own engineer, sworn, had just handed the machine to the man who made it. Judge Hargrove wrote for a while in his own hand. The room waited. Then he set down his pen. I find, he said, that Silas Renner is the sole and true inventor of the device covered by patent number 1144207. I find that the assignment of 1924 was procured by fraud and misrepresentation, and I hold it void from the day it was signed. He looked over his glasses at the Ashmore side of the table. The patent is restored to Mr. Renner's name. It has, by my count, 3 years yet to run inside its term, and the royalty on it belongs to him, and has belonged to him since 1924. Fisk stood. Your Honor, we've calculated the withheld royalty. 14 years, on every frame these mills have run on my client's governor. Read it, said the judge. $18,600, Fisk said. In 1938. In a mill town in the middle of the Depression, where a hand made $12 a week if he was lucky. $18,600. You could hear it go through the wall into the hall, the number, passed hand to hand out into the crowd of mill workers. And you could hear the sound they made. Not a cheer. Something lower than a cheer. Something like a long breath let out by 300 people at once. And continuing, the judge said, a royalty on every frame that carries his design for as long as that patent lives. Mr. Ashmore, your father built a fine mill. He built part of it on another man's name. That debt comes due today. He picked his pen back up. We're adjourned. Gerald Ashmore sat there while the room emptied. He did not get up for a long time. When he finally did, he crossed to the old man's side of the table, and his lawyers hissed at him not to, and he ignored them. He stood in front of Silas Renner. He was a rich man in a good suit facing a sweeper in a clean worn shirt. And it was the sweeper who had the dignity. I didn't know, Gerald said. His voice broke on it. Mr. Renner, I swear before God I didn't know what my father did. The papers said. I know you didn't, Silas said. Quiet, not unkind. You believed your father. A man ought to be able to believe his father. He looked at Gerald a moment. The frame's still yours to run. I only ever wanted my name on it. Nettie told me that. Took me 14 years to hear her. And that was all he gave. No triumph. No twisting of the knife. Gerald Ashmore would carry the shame of his father's crime the rest of his life, and Silas Renner did not add 1 ounce to it, because he was a bigger man than the men who'd mocked him, and he always had been. And that was the whole point that the mill had failed to see for 30 years. Out in the hall, Crane could not look up from his shoes when the old man passed. 14 years he'd taken his cues from the front office. 14 years he'd mistaken gray hair for uselessness. He'd have given a great deal, in that moment, to have offered the old man a stool instead of a broom. He said nothing. There was nothing to say that wouldn't have shamed them both. And Vance was in the hallway, near the door, with his hat in his hands. When Silas came through the crowd of mill hands, and they made way for him, and more than one of them reached out just to touch his sleeve, Vance stepped forward. The proud man. The Northern College. And in front of all 40 of the hands who had watched him call this old man a broom, Preston Vance took off his hat. He didn't make a speech. He wasn't the type. He just held his hat against his chest while the old man passed, the way you'd do at a funeral, or in a church, or when something larger than you goes by and you know it. Silas stopped in front of him. The whole hall watched. The old man looked at the young engineer for a moment, and he gave him the one sentence. The only one he offered that whole long day. The sentence I've been holding for you since the courthouse steps. It was always my name, son, Silas said. I just finally signed it. And he put his hat back on his own head. And he walked out of the county courthouse into the autumn light, 63 years old, an inventor, with 300 people who had once watched him sweep now watching him walk free, and he did not look back at any of it. He went to work the next morning. I want you to sit with that. He didn't have to. $18,600 in 1938 and a continuing royalty on every frame. He could have hung up his apron and never smelled cotton lint again as long as he lived. Fisk told him as much. Told him he'd never have to work another day. Silas Renner said, "And do what?" And he walked the 2 miles in the gray morning and came in through the same door. And the floor went quiet the way it had gone quiet in the courthouse, and then something happened that had never happened on that floor in the whole history of the mill. The hands stood up. At their frames, all down the long aisle under the humming lights, the men and the women who ran the spinning frames stood up as the old man walked in, and they were quiet, and they watched him come. And the boy of 19, the one who'd been given the stool, the one who'd taken his place, the boy came down the aisle wheeling that stool ahead of him, the very stool. And he set it down where it belonged, at the No. 9. And he stepped back, and his face was red, and he couldn't get a word out. Silas put his hand on the boy's shoulder. "It's all right, son," he said. "You keep the one they gave you. I don't need to sit to oil a frame. And he took the brass can out of his apron, the one worn smooth, the one stamped with two faint letters that everyone in that building finally understood, and he went to the No. 9. And he found the place at the base of the main casting where the initials were cut into the iron. The S and the R he had wiped clean and covered with his thumb every morning for 30 years. And this morning he did not cover them. He let them show. He oiled the frame. And the 120 spindles of the No. 9 turned in the light, and the old man tended them, and the mill ran on. And the 22,000 yards of railway cloth went out on time, and Ashmore Cotton Mills did not shut its doors, and 300 families kept their wages, all because of the hands of a man they had called a broom. 6 months on, if you'd walked the floor of the Ashmore mill in the spring of 1939, you'd have found a thing that hadn't been there before. A small brass plate screwed to the frame of the No. 9, polished bright by somebody's hand. 2 words on it. Renner Governor. And under the plate, most days, you'd have found the man himself, and beside him 2 young hands, a boy and a girl not yet 20, learning the machine, learning where to touch it and where not to. Learning that a spinning frame will tell you what's wrong with it a full day before it breaks, if you know how to listen, and that the listening is the whole trade and can't be drawn on any blueprint. He taught them with the brass oiler in his palm, catching the light off the tall windows, and when the girl asked him once what the letters on the can stood for, the old man turned it over in his fingers and looked at them a while. "Fella's name," he said. "Slow learner. Took him too long to sign it." That was all. That was Silas. Preston Vance wrote him a letter that year, from up north where he'd gone to a bigger works. A short letter, from a proud man, which is the hardest kind to write. He asked, plainly, with no more contempt left in him anywhere, if he might be permitted to study the design of the compensating governor. To learn how it was done. From the man who'd done it. Silas wrote back 3 lines, said the boy could come in the summer if he wanted, and bring his tools, and be prepared to sweep the floor first, because that's where a man learns what a machine sounds like when nobody's helping it. Vance came. He swept the floor. I'm told he did it without one word of complaint, and that the old man, watching him push the broom down the long aisle, almost smiled. And every quarter, regular as the seasons, a letter came from the lawyers in Greensboro on behalf of Ashmore Cotton Mills, and inside it was a check, the royalty, paid on time and in full, signed by Gerald Ashmore's own hand. Silas cashed them. He gave most of it away, to the church, to the widow's fund, to the families of hands who'd taken sick. He kept the mill house he'd lived in with Nettie, and he kept his job, and he kept his brass can, and he wanted nothing else. Because he'd never wanted the money. You understand that by now. He'd only ever wanted the name. The trunk went back under the cot, the shawl folded on top. But the drawings didn't go back in it. He framed the original patent letter, the one from Washington with the seal, the one addressed to Mr. Silas Renner, and he hung it on the wall of the house where he could see it from his chair. Not out of pride. Out of something quieter than pride, out of keeping a promise to a woman 4 years gone. Because here is the whole of it. Here is what the old man knew, that the young engineer and the mill president and the superintendent all had to learn the hard way. In a warm room, in front of everybody, a man can do the finest work of his life for 30 years in silence. He can cut his name into the iron where no one will ever see it, and let that be enough. And tell himself that the doing is its own reward, that the machine knows even if no one else does. And there's a kind of pride in that, a quiet pride. Silas had it. But his Nettie was right. A name means nothing if you're too proud to sign it. The work isn't finished when the machine runs, it's finished when you have the courage to put your name on it out loud, in the daylight, in front of the ones who said you were nothing. Not for the money, not even for the credit, for the truth of it. Because the truth deserves a signature, and a man who hides from that is stealing from himself just as surely as they stole from him. Silas Renner oiled the No. 9 for another 11 years. They say the frame outlasted every modern machine Vance ever installed. They say when they finally retired it, they didn't scrap it, the last of the old hands wouldn't let them. They unbolted the base casting with the 2 letters cut in it, the S and the R, and they hung it on the wall of the mill office next to a small brass plate that read Renner Governor, and it's there yet, or so I'm told, in a mill town in North Carolina, where an old man once swept the lint under a machine he had built with his own hands and waited 30 years to sign his name. If this story reached you, if you know what it is to do good work that nobody sees, then do the old man one kindness. Comment the town you're watching from. I want to see how far Silas Renner has finally traveled. Because a name means nothing until you're brave enough to say it out loud. And his has been said now, in 100 cities, by you. Thank you for staying to the end.